Good morning, Nick Skrip here live on the Fantrax YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok channels. We're talking week 4 fantasy football player spotlights. I look at matchups every single week and who has a plus matchup that will translate hopefully to fantasy football and DFS. So let's get into that right here. All right, so each week I write an article on the Fantrax website. We look at each matchup, who has a plus matchup within it. So I look at fantasy points per game allowed by defenses. I look at yardage allowed by defenses. I reflect on the previous week to say, hey, if I'm highlighting a specific position, this position did this week 2, week 1, etc. So hopefully that helps you guys set some lineups here. Hopefully it helps you guys with some DFS plays. So we have an early game out in London, created a super cool graphic on the Fantrax socials for that London game. It's at 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. You have the Falcons versus the Jaguars. I think they're doing some sort of like Toy Story plug for the kids. I don't know if like the whole thing's animated or what that looks like exactly, but the NFL finds different ways to expand their audience a little bit. I think they're aiming at kids for this one. So Falcons side of the ball, Kyle Pitts. I called Kyle Pitts in last week's article and on the podcast, and it was his best week, I guess. It wasn't the week we exactly wanted, but I'm going to try it one more time here. The Jaguars allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to tight ends. Brevin Jordan scored last week. Travis Kelce scored in week 2, and Kyle Granson caught 4 passes for 39 yards in week 1 against the Jaguars. Pitts is coming off of a season high 78% of the snaps, season high, 9 targets, season high, 5 receptions, season high, 8.7 fantasy points. So the fantasy points, not exactly, going to help you win your week last week, but I think things are trending up. He's an amazing talent. I think the narrative of scoring overseas is going to be tossed out there a little bit, but the matchup's good. We're hoping we get a Kyle Pitts week. I think after this week, just seeing it is a plus matchup and seeing that in week 3, everything was trending up. If it doesn't work out, I think it's going to be hard to play him just at all. I think you're going to have to just take shots at streamers based off of other matchups. Same game, I really like Evan Ingram this week. The Falcons allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. Sam Laporta caught 8 passes for 84 yards and a score last week. And then in week 1, Hayden Hurst had that big game where he caught 5 passes for 41 yards and a touchdown. So that's all against Atlanta. Evan Ingram has had back-to-back weeks with 8 targets, and he's been trending up in receiving, 49, 57, 66 yards, and also fantasy point scoring, 9.9, 11.7, and 13.7. So it's looking good for Evan Ingram. I like him a lot this week. Then going to the normal slate of games, the noon games, we have the Rams versus the Colts. Matthew Stafford. The Colts currently allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 10th most passing yards per game this season. Lamar Jackson finished with 303 scrimmage yards last week. C.J. Stroud for 384 yards and 2 touchdowns in week 2. Trevor Lawrence, 241 yards and 2 touchdowns and an interception in week 1, all against the Colts. Matthew Stafford currently ranks 2nd in passing attempts, 126, and 4th in passing yards with 910 through 3 weeks of football. If he starts to throw more touchdowns, I think that's when it can translate better to fantasy football, and I think this week's matchup is a good one. Same game, Zach Moss. The Rams are not, they're not necessarily a big plus matchup to any specific position, but I do want to highlight Zach Moss here just because it's a case of riding the hot hand if you have him for fantasy football. He's been a guy that, is probably juggled in starting lineups because, again, it's not a guy we expect to be performing the way he has, but I think there's a true case to ride the hot hand when it comes to Zach Moss. He missed week 1, but then he went on to play 98% and 78% of the snaps the last 2 games with 88 and 122 rushing yards. 2 total touchdowns the last 2 weeks, with both weeks resulting in top 10 fantasy performances for the running back position. So Zach Moss right now is hot, and I think he should be in lineups. Obviously, depending on who else you have, but he's been rushing the ball very well, and they're getting their guy back with Anthony Richardson this week. The Ravens versus the Browns, always a fun one. Zay Flowers, I want to talk about. The Browns are one of the worst matchups for fantasy football right now. It might be the single worst fantasy football matchup just because they have not allowed much to anybody this year. I looked at last year's games, which I thought was interesting. Mark Andrews, he scored zero point 0.4 and then 6.1 fantasy points in the two matchups against Cleveland. It makes me think that, the defense, the focus there, and somebody commented this on Twitter when I said this before, like who else do they have to focus on? But my alarm's going off here. But I do think that those numbers, just seeing that he had 3 catches in both of those 2 games combined, says that Cleveland made a point to stop Mark Andrews last year. There's more context to that other people have pointed out, but the numbers are the numbers. Mark Andrews in both of those matchups were not the best. Zay Flowers currently leads Baltimore with 25 targets on the season with 2 games of 10 plus targets, or 2 games of 10 targets. So I think it was week 1, 10 targets, week 3, 10 targets. It's a good sign for a rookie. Flowers has scored double-digit fantasy points in all 3 weeks, and he opened up week 1 with 78 receiving yards and 17.7 fantasy points. So Zay Flowers is a huge piece of this offense, and if that trend stays for Cleveland focusing in on Mark Andrews, I think that he could have another good week if he's getting the looks that he should. Same game, Elijah Moore, I want to talk about. The Ravens allow the 8th most fantasy points per game this season. 2 wide receivers. Michael Pittman Jr. caught 9 balls for 77 yards last week. Nico Collins in week 2, in week 1, 6 passes for 80 yards. T. Higgins had that huge week against the Ravens. 8 passes, caught for 89 yards and 2 touchdowns. Amari Cooper obviously stands out in this matchup because he's the guy that's actually been hot for the Browns. But I want to again highlight Elijah Moore, who is trending up. Back-to-back games of 9 targets for Moore. It makes it clear that he is Deshaun Watson's number 2. 11.8 fantasy points last week was a sign for better scoring, I think, to come. I think he's due for his first big game as a Cleveland Brown. The Vikings versus the Panthers. So Alexander Mattison, I haven't been a big fan of his coming into the season. He started the first 2 weeks terrible. He was really, really inefficient, didn't do much for fantasy football, but Carolina allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs this season and is tied for the 5th most rushing yards per game allowed. Kenneth Walker, the 3rd, rushed for 97 and 2 touchdowns last week. Tony Jones Jr. rushed for 2 touchdowns in week 2. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier have combined in week 1 for 131 rushing yards and 3 total touchdowns against the Panthers. Alexander Mattison had a rough first 2 weeks with efficiency, like we just talked about in fantasy scoring, but he did just rush 20 times for 93 yards last week, and he caught 5 passes, which was big for him. That led to 17.5 fantasy points. So Cam Akers may appear this week in his first game as a Viking, but I doubt that he steps into this huge role and he just takes away a majority of the snaps from Mattison. As the season goes on, can that happen? Sure, that can happen. But I think coming off of a really good week in a plus matchup, Alexander Mattison becomes a good play this week. Revenge game. We've got to talk about the revenge game. Adam Thielen. So the Vikings allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year and are tied for 7th most in passing yards per game allowed. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams combined for 336 receiving yards last week. Devonta Smith finished with 131 receiving yards himself and a touchdown in week 2. Mike Evans had 66 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 1, all against the Vikings. So they are very, very friendly to wide receivers. Adam Thielen has been targeted 23 times in the last 2 games, scoring a touchdown in both of those 2 weeks. 20.4 and 31.5 fantasy points. So this is another case of ride the hot hand, and I like a revenge game. I like this sort of case. He's playing his former team he spent plenty of time with. Many people will say, well, he had his best week with Andy Dalton, but 2 weeks ago, 20.4 fantasy points with Bryce Young. I think that he's being targeted at a high rate. I think he's getting plenty of looks in the end zone. And I think if the Panthers were real, they'll try to get him to score on his former team in the Vikings. Bengals versus the Titans. So everyone's playing Jamar Chase, right? You do every week, but maybe he's a good DFS play this week. The Titans allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards per game. Amari Cooper caught 7 passes for 116 yards and a touchdown last week. Keenan Allen combined with Mike Williams for 194 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in week 2. And then in week 1, Chris Olave caught 8 passes for 112 receiving yards, all against the Titans. Jamar Chase had a slow first 2 weeks, but he's coming off of a game he caught 12 of his 15 targets for 141 receiving yards. Chase is lined up to continue in this upward trend in a great matchup against the Titans. Other side of the ball, DeAndre Hopkins has been the only guy for the Titans that's shown us like fantasy football life. He opened up the season, week 1, 13 targets. It's a matchup where we know that the Bengals are going to be a strong offense. So I think the Titans, especially just seeing like Derrick Henry and Tajay Spears both getting, time on the field almost to an equal level. Spears is actually playing more lately. It's strange what's going on there, but I think Treylon Burks has been ruled out of this one. DeAndre Hopkins is the only guy showing signs of life in that offense. I think he's the only guy you even think about really playing right now. I guess Derrick Henry is always a play, but he's been pretty concerning for fantasy football, just in all honesty. The Buccaneers versus the Saints. Let's talk about Chris Godwin. So the Saints are another team that creates, difficulty highlighting anybody here because they don't show many plus matchups for fantasy football purposes. What's going to be focused here is Mike Evans versus, Marshawn Lattimore and what might turn into, a boxing event. It's been like this historical fight night between those two guys. So that's going to be a locked in matchup, especially seeing that Mike Evans has been good this season, pretty solid. Chris Godwin has yet to do anything fantasy relevant this season, but he could be, finally lined up for a game where the focus is on Mike Evans because of that. And because of Mike Evans being the hot guy. Godwin finished 2022 with a career high 142 targets. And we're hoping we see similar to what we saw in week 2 where Baker Mayfield targeted him 8 times. So I think this is a matchup where it is a tough matchup, and Mike Evans probably is the focus of it. So hopefully we see finally a Chris Godwin week. Chris Olave, again, he's always in your lineup, but I think he can have a really, really nice week against the Buccaneers. They allow the 11th most fantasy points per game, 2 wide receivers, and the 9th most passing yards per game this season. A.J. Brown finished with 131 receiving yards last week. DJ Moore, 104 receiving yards in week 2. And Justin Jefferson, who we expect, but had 150 receiving yards against Tampa Bay in week 1. Chris Olave has been consistently targeted, 10, 11, 11 targets, and consistently is putting up good receiving numbers, which we expected out of him, but he's been very good with that, 112, 86, and 104 receiving yards across 3 games. It looks like Derek Carr supposed to play. I kind of wanted to see Jameis Winston out there, but Chris Olave, very consistent, very good matchup. The Dolphins versus the Bills. So I want to talk about Raheem Mostert. The Bills are a tough matchup for fantasy football, but I want to emphasize a note here. Devon Achane, I think he wanted to be called something different. I'd have to go back and reflect on that. But the rookie nearly broke fantasy football last week. He had over 50 fantasy points. So it seems like, Raheem Mostert being the second best guy last week, 45.2 fantasy points, is still in the shadow because 1, Chain's a rookie, and 2, he was the best scorer of the week last week. So looking at Mostert, he's played 73%, 51% of the snaps the last 3 weeks. He has totaled 7 touchdowns on the year, 121 rushing yards, and 82 rushing yards the last 2 weeks on a highly efficient 6.72 and 6.31 yards per attempt. So the rookie's role can obviously grow. I'm sure he's earned the right to touch the ball plenty in week 4. But don't forget that Raheem Mostert has been a dog this season. He's been very good this season for fantasy football, for yardage, for the Dolphins in general. So don't, fear still playing Raheem Mostert just because the rookie came in and had a good week. James Cook, another running back, same matchup. The Dolphins allow the 9th most fantasy points per game, 2 running backs in the 9th most rushing yards per game. Ramondre Stevenson rushed for a touchdown in week 2. Week 1, Austin Eckler combined with Joshua Kelly for 208 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. James Cook right now is running the ball very well for the Buffalo Bills. It's a good matchup for him to continue to do that in week 4. Got the Super Bowl matchup here, the Broncos versus the Bears. And I can joke like that because I'm a Bears fan and life is not the most fun right now. But Javonte Williams, you have to talk about him in this matchup. The Bears allow the second most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Both Isaiah Pacheco, Clyde Edwards-Helaire rushed for a touchdown, and Jerick McKinnon scored 2 receiving touchdowns last week alone against Chicago. The week prior, Rachaad White, 73 rushing yards and a touchdown. Week 2, Aaron Jones scored both a rushing and a receiving touchdown against the Bears. So everybody is scoring touchdowns from the running back position against the Bears. Javonte Williams, he's had a slow start to the season, which is expected. He's coming off of that ACL injury. Williams has still touched the ball those 17, 15, and 13 times the last 3 weeks. I think he has a true opportunity to be one of the better running backs of the week against Chicago that everybody is tearing up from the running back position. Justin Fields, same game. Bear with me. The Broncos allow the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. Tua just threw 309 and 4 touchdowns last week. Sam Howell threw 220. Start this over. Tua threw 309 and 4 touchdowns last week. Sam Howell threw for 299 and 2 touchdowns in week 2. Week 1, Jimmy Garoppolo threw a pair of touchdowns all against the Broncos. It's a really good matchup for quarterbacks. Justin Fields has been disappointing for fantasy football. We know this. Like we get it this season after he scored the 6th most total fantasy points for the position last season. The positive note, though, is that Justin Fields has had 2 games over 200 yards passing, and that matches the amount of games he had that last season for the entire year. So he's throwing the ball more, right? If the Bears focused their playbook like they did last season, it took them 6 weeks last season for the Bears to make Justin Fields the focus of their playbook. The designed runs, the different play schemes that they had. It took them 6 weeks last year. Right now, it's looking like it's taken them at least 4 this season. If the playbook is focused more around Justin Fields, this is such a great matchup that I think he has a top 5 week and he gets back to being the Justin Fields for fantasy football that we loved last year. The Commanders versus the Eagles. Let's talk about Logan Thomas. Hear me out on this one because I feel like he's a bit of a sleeper this week. The Eagles are the best fantasy matchup in points per game allowed to tight ends this season. Week 1, we had Hunter Henry scored a touchdown, 5 passes caught for 56 yards against the Eagles. Then in week 2, TJ Hawkinson, he caught 7 passes for 66 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Eagles. Logan Thomas was targeted 8 times in week 1. He led the Commanders in targets that week. And then the very next week, he scored a touchdown, but he had to leave the game early due to a concussion. And that's what held him out last week. So he looks like he's a big piece of this offense. And I think he is going to be a safety outlet for Sam Howell in a tough Eagles matchup. A.J. Brown, maybe a good DFS play, but the Commanders allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. Stephon Diggs caught 8 balls for 111 yards last week against the Commanders. In week 2, all of Marvin Mims Jr., Cortland Sutton, and Brandon Johnson combined for 245 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns against the Commanders. A.J. Brown was targeted 10 times in week 1 and then 14 times last week. And that's where we saw the typical A.J. Brown week where he had 131 receiving yards on the day. So great matchup, high upside wide receiver. A.J. Brown for DFS, at least. He's always in your fantasy football lineup. Good play for this week. The Steelers versus the Texans. Another guy people are giving up on when it comes to fantasy football, Najee Harris. I want to highlight him in this matchup. Houston allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. They were the best matchup for fantasy football last year. So not much has changed for Houston. Even though they brought in Will Anderson, that's a huge grab for them in the draft, but they're still very, very, juicy for the running back position. Travis Etienne rushed for 88 yards last week. Zach Moss, 88 yards as well and a touchdown in week 2. And then 3 Ravens rushing touchdowns in week 1, all against Houston. So it's been a rough year for Najee Harris. We know that. He has yet to score 7 fantasy points, and he's splitting work with Jaylen Warren to a degree. The biggest signs, though, from last week were, number 1, 19 rushing attempts. That's a great sign. It's more than his week 1 and week 2 rushing attempt totals combined. Another good sign, 65 rushing yards. That's trending up, right? And then this specific matchup is number 3, Those three signs make Najee Harris a good play for week 4. Tank Dell, I think a few times on this podcast here, I've talked about riding the hot hand. Tank Dell is hot right now. The Steelers allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 11th most passing yards per game this season. Devontae Adams, 13 passes caught for 172 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns last week. Amari Cooper finished with 90 receiving yards in week 2. Brandon Ayuk caught 8 passes for 129 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in week 1, all against the Steelers. Tank Dell has been great for fantasy football the last 2 games. He's finished with over 20 fantasy points in back-to-back weeks. 7 catches on 10 targets for 72 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 2. And then he caught 5 passes on 7 targets for 145 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 3. So back-to-back weeks, good fantasy scoring, highly targeted, very productive. Ride the hot hand while it's hot. All right, we have the Raiders versus the Chargers. Jacoby Myers I want to talk about. I know the quarterback situation. You have to go and look at that. I have yet to actually dive into that. I usually look at the injury stuff closer to 10 a.m. Central Time, my time, 2 hours before the game. So pay attention to what quarterback is starting. Is it Jimmy Garoppolo? Is it Brian Hoyer? Is it Aiden O'Connell? But the Chargers are the best fantasy matchup in points per game allowed to wide receivers this season, and they are the only team in the NFL to allow over 1,000 receiving yards so far this year. A lot of this came from Tyreek Hill's 215 receiving yard week in week 1. But in 2 of the Chargers' 3 games, they have allowed the second highest receiving total of that week of the opposing team to hit 78 yards. So whoever was number 1 in receiving that week for the other team, their number 2 guy hit at least 78 receiving yards. Jacoby Myers was targeted 10 times in week 1 and then 12 times in week 3 after he missed week 2. So all Jacoby Myers has done has earned double-digit targets in the 2 games he's played. He finished with 80 receiving yards, and he scored twice in week 1. Devontae Adams is such a major piece of focus for defenses that I think Jacoby Myers, who is good at just getting open and making the simple plays, is a big beneficiary, and I think he deserves to be in lineups right now as a flex. Other guy I want to highlight here, same matchup, Gerald Everett. The Raiders allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. Pat Freiermuth scored a touchdown last week. Dalton Kincaid combined with Dawson Knox, who scored for 8 receptions in week 2. And then Greg Dulcich combined with Adam Troutman for 7 catches in week 1, all against the Raiders. Mike Williams, unfortunately, tore his ACL, and that drew the big question. Is it Joshua Palmer or is it Quentin Johnston? Not enough people have said, hey, maybe Gerald Everett is a big beneficiary, and I think he should be looked at because he was targeted 6 times last week, and he caught all 6 of those targets. So 87 targets last year was a career high for Gerald Everett. I think that he's going to be a guy that gets a bump in this offense. The only downside, and many people have pointed out, is that Parham, the other tight end in the system, gets a lot of looks in the red zone, but I think Gerald Everett is going to take a bump and a step forward in a plus matchup this week with Mike Williams out. Cardinals versus the 49ers. We got 2 more games here. James Conner. So the 49ers are a tough matchup for fantasy, but are the least harsh when we're looking at what they allow to running backs. They allow the 15th most fantasy points per game to running backs, which isn't necessarily a plus matchup, but it's better than what they allow to other positions. Matt Breida last week, filling in for Saquon Barkley, scored a rushing touchdown, and Kyron Williams scored both a rushing and a receiving touchdown in week 2 against the 49ers. James Conner has touched the ball 19, 23, and 16 times in the last 3 weeks, and he's totaled 62, 106, and 98 rushing yards the last 3 games. Back-to-back weeks with a rushing touchdown for Conner as well. Tough matchup, but Conner is the workhorse on this team, and he should be played because he's touching the ball a lot, and he's been fairly productive. Brock Purdy, the Cardinals allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 12th most passing yards per game this season. Dak Prescott threw for 249, a touchdown last week. Daniel Jones, 321 and 2 touchdowns in week 2. Sam Howell threw for 202 yards and a touchdown in week 1 against the Cardinals. All noted quarterbacks also threw 1 pick in those games, but Brock Purdy's coming off of a game he threw for 310 yards and 2 touchdowns, which marks his 2nd game throwing 2 touchdowns this season. Purdy has yet to turn over the ball, so he's competent, he's efficient. Last game we'll cover on this podcast here, and then we're going to close it down for YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. I'll stay live here on TikTok and answer some questions after. But Patriots versus the Cowboys. So Ezekiel Elliott, yet another revenge game narrative. The Cowboys are a tough matchup for fantasy football this year, but I gotta plug these revenge games, especially if Zeke's a guy that couldn't get a touch in the end zone and score on his former team. Ramondre Stevenson continues to touch the ball and play a higher percentage of the snaps over Zeke, but this is looking like a true committee in New England. Zeke is coming off of a more efficient game on the ground than Ramondre Stevenson. In week 3, he rushed the ball 16 times for 80 yards. If the Patriots get in a scoring position for someone to punch it in, they got to give it to Zeke, right? You'd hope that they'd say, hey, former team, let's get him the ball. Let's get Zeke to score this week. Other side of the ball, Tony Pollard. The Patriots allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. The standout performance against the Patriots was Raheem Mostert's 121 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns back in week 2. Tony Pollard has been consistent for fantasy football so far this season with 3 straight games over 15 fantasy points. In week 1, Pollard scored 2 touchdowns. In week 2, he caught 7 passes. And in week 3, he finished with a season-high 122 rushing yards. So 3 different signs right there: touchdowns, receptions, good rushing yards. Put that together, Tony Pollard is in a position to be one of the better plays for fantasy football just due to consistency in those boxes that he checks. So that'll do it. Make sure you check your lineups for the Falcons and the Jaguars game this morning. I think it's like Toy Story themed. Should be fun for the kids. Hopefully that can give you the excuse to say, hey, let's get the kids in front of the TV for this game. Make sure you are following the Fantrax socials on all platforms. We are everywhere, and we are consistently plugging content. I'll stay live on TikTok here, close up on everywhere else. But good luck this week, guys.